December 7th, the nurse who saved 100 lives during Pearl Harbor paradise before the storm. December 6, 1941. The island of Oahu was paradise on earth. Palm trees swayed in the warm Pacific breeze. The crystal blue waters of Pearl Harbor reflected the morning sun like a mirror. For the thousands of American servicemen and women stationed there, Hawaii felt less like a military posting and more like a permanent vacation. Dorothy Still was 23 years old. She had joined the Navy Nurse Corps just 18 months earlier, fresh out of nursing school in Philadelphia. Her assignment to the USS Solace, anchored peacefully in Pearl Harbor, seemed like winning the lottery. The Solace was a hospital ship, a floating medical facility designed to treat injured sailors. But in the sleepy waters of Hawaii, there were rarely any patients. Dorothy spent her days organizing medical supplies, updating patient records that barely existed, and writing letters home to her mother. "Hawaii is paradise," she wrote on the evening of December 6, "nothing ever happens here." The most exciting thing this week was treating a sailor for sunburn. She had no idea that in less than 12 hours, she would be fighting to save lives in conditions more brutal than any battlefield surgeon had ever faced. That Saturday evening, Dorothy and several other nurses attended a dance at the officers' club. Big band music filled the warm night air. Sailors in their dress whites twirled nurses across the polished floor. Laughter echoed through the tropical evening. Dorothy danced until nearly midnight, her feet aching in her heels. She returned to the Solace just after 1 a.m., collapsing into her bunk with a smile on her face. She had no way of knowing that 230 miles to the north, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming toward Hawaii at full speed. Aboard those carriers, 353 aircraft were being armed and fueled for the most devastating surprise attack in American history. Dorothy Still slept peacefully, dreaming of nothing more troubling than the handsome sailor who had asked for her address. In 6 hours and 55 minutes, everything would change forever. The morning thunder. Sunday morning, December 7th, 7:50 a.m. Dorothy woke to the sound of distant rumbling. Half asleep, she assumed it was thunder. But something felt wrong. The rumbling was too rhythmic, too regular. And it was getting closer. She swung her legs out of bed and padded across the small cabin to the porthole. What she saw made absolutely no sense. The USS Arizona, one of America's most powerful battleships, was erupting in flames. Massive columns of black smoke poured into the previously clear sky. Another explosion rocked a nearby ship. Then another. And another. Dorothy's mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. This couldn't be an accident. This was impossible. They were in Hawaii. America wasn't at war. Who would attack them here? Then she saw the planes. Dozens of them, swooping low over the harbor like angry hornets. Even from a distance, she could see the red circles painted on their wings. The rising sun emblem of Japan. Her heart stopped. This was real. This was happening. America was under attack. The ship's alarm began wailing. Voices shouted through the corridors. "All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill. All medical personnel report immediately." Dorothy ran. She pulled on her white uniform in seconds, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. Her mind was racing. She was a nurse, trained to handle medical emergencies in calm, controlled hospital environments. She had never even seen a combat wound. How was she supposed to handle this? As she burst onto the main deck of the Solace, reality hit her like a physical blow. The entire harbor was on fire. Battleship Row, where America's most powerful warships were moored, had become an inferno. The USS Oklahoma was capsizing, rolling over like a dying whale. Men were jumping into water that was coated with burning oil. The screams were audible even over the roar of explosions. And the Solace was about to become the only hospital for miles around. The deluge. Within minutes, the wounded began arriving. Small boats, life rafts, anything that could float brought injured men to the Solace. They came covered in oil, burned beyond recognition, bleeding from wounds Dorothy had only seen in textbooks. The first man she treated was a sailor from the USS West Virginia. His name was Jimmy Larson. He was 19 years old. Half of his body was covered in third-degree burns. His uniform had melted into his skin. He was screaming for his mother. Dorothy had 3 seconds to make a choice. She could freeze. She could run to find a more experienced nurse. She could panic. Or she could do her job. She grabbed scissors and began cutting away the burned fabric fused to his skin. Her hands moved automatically, her training taking over even as her mind struggled to comprehend the horror. She injected morphine. She cleaned the wounds with solutions that made Jimmy scream even louder. She wrapped him in gauze with hands that somehow weren't shaking. "You're going to be okay," she told him, lying with a conviction that surprised her. "You're going to survive this." Jimmy Larson would survive. He would be one of the first of many. But there was no time to celebrate. 3 more boats had just arrived, each carrying a dozen wounded men. The Solace's small medical staff was completely overwhelmed. Dorothy looked around frantically. There were only 8 nurses aboard, and dozens of men needed immediate attention. Chief Medical Officer Commander Johnson appeared beside her. His face was grim. "Still," he said urgently, "you're now in charge of triage on the main deck. Sort them. Critical, serious, minor. Do it fast. We can't save everyone, so we have to save who we can." Dorothy was 23 years old. She had been a qualified nurse for less than 2 years. And she had just been given the power to decide who lived and who died. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Decisions in blood. The human mind is an extraordinary thing. In moments of extreme crisis, it can process information faster than any computer. It can make split-second decisions based on minimal information. It can override fear and function with crystal clarity even in chaos. Dorothy Still discovered this gift in herself that morning. As burnt, bleeding men were carried onto the deck around her, something clicked inside her mind. The panic disappeared. The fear evaporated. In its place came a cold, focused determination. She moved from man to man, assessing each in seconds. This one had shrapnel wounds but was conscious and coherent, he could wait. This one had severe burns but his airways were clear, urgent but stable. This one had a sucking chest wound and was turning blue, critical, immediate attention needed. "You 4, she pointed at sailors who had arrived with minor wounds, "you're now medical assistants. Do exactly what I tell you. Grab those supply crates and follow me." She had never given orders to military personnel before. She had no authority to commandeer sailors as medical staff. But in that moment, nobody questioned her. The men simply obeyed. Dorothy set up a triage system that would later be studied in military medical schools. She divided the deck into 3 zones, red for critical, yellow for serious, green for minor. She assigned her improvised medical team specific tasks. One sailor became responsible for 4 fluids. Another for cleaning and bandaging. A third for moving patients between zones as their conditions changed. And she moved between them all like a whirlwind, making 100 tiny decisions every minute. This burn victim needed immediate fluid replacement. That shrapnel wound needed debridement before infection set in. This man's pulse was weakening, move him to critical care now. The bombs were still falling. Explosions continued to rock the harbor. A Japanese plane screamed past so close that Dorothy could see the pilot's face. Machine gun fire stitched across the water just 50 yards away. But Dorothy barely noticed. She was too focused on the man in front of her who had stopped breathing. She tilted his head back, cleared his airway, and began manual respiration. 30 seconds later, he gasped and his eyes fluttered open. Dorothy was already moving to the next patient before he could thank her. Hours blurred together. The sun climbed higher in the smoke-filled sky. The attack finally ended, but the casualties kept coming. Rescue parties were pulling men from sunken ships, diving into flooded compartments, cutting through twisted metal to reach trapped sailors. By noon, Dorothy Still had personally treated over 60 men. Under her supervision, her improvised medical team had handled dozens more. The deck of the Solace looked like a nightmare, blood, oil, and seawater mixed together in a grotesque soup. But it was working. Men who should have died were breathing. Sailors who would have bled out were stabilized. Dorothy hadn't eaten. Hadn't drunk water. Hadn't sat down once in over 4 hours. Her white uniform was so soaked with blood it looked brown. Her hands ached from gripping surgical instruments. Her voice was hoarse from shouting orders. But she couldn't stop. Because they were still bringing in wounded. The darkest hour. By mid-afternoon, Dorothy was beginning to falter. The adrenaline that had sustained her was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that made her movements slow and clumsy. She had been working non-stop for 8 hours. Her hands were shaking. Her vision was starting to blur. Then they brought in the men from the USS Arizona. The Arizona had taken a direct hit to her forward ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion had been so massive it had lifted the 33,000-ton battleship out of the water. Over 1,000 men had died instantly. But some had survived, trapped in flooded compartments, swimming through burning oil, clinging to wreckage in the fire-filled harbor. The survivors were in the worst condition Dorothy had seen yet. These weren't just burns and shrapnel wounds. These were men who had been through hell. Many had inhaled superheated smoke that had seared their lungs. Others had oil-filled wounds that were already showing signs of infection. Some had been in the water so long they were hypothermic despite the warm Hawaiian climate. One of them was a young ensign named Robert Miller. He was 21 years old, and both of his legs were crushed. The ship's surgeon took one look and shook his head at Dorothy. The meaning was clear: this man couldn't be saved. Focus resources on men with a chance. Dorothy looked down at Ensign Miller. His eyes were open, clear, aware. He knew he was dying. He looked up at her with an expression that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Please," he whispered. "I don't want to die alone." For the first time that day, Dorothy Still broke. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands, which had been steady through hours of horror, began to shake uncontrollably. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't watch another boy die. She couldn't make another impossible choice. Then she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Chief Nurse Laura Cobb, the head of the Solace's nursing staff. Cobb was in her 40s, a veteran with years of experience. She had been working in the surgery bay all day, and this was the first time Dorothy had seen her since the attack began. "Dorothy," Cobb said quietly, "look at me." Dorothy turned, tears still running down her face. "Do you know how many men you've saved today?" Cobb asked. Dorothy shook her head mutely. "Over 70. By yourself, you've saved over 70 lives. Men who would be dead if not for you." Cobb's eyes were fierce. "So you're going to take a 5-minute break. You're going to drink some water and eat something. And then you're going to get back to work. Because there are still men who need you." Dorothy wanted to argue. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to run away from this nightmare and never come back. Instead, she nodded. She knelt down beside Ensign Miller, took his hand, and stayed with him. She couldn't save his life, but she could give him something almost as important: companionship in his final moments. Robert Miller died peacefully 7 minutes later, Dorothy's hand in his. Then Dorothy stood up, wiped her face, and went back to work. Aftermath and legacy. The casualties continued arriving throughout the night. Dorothy worked straight through until 4 a.m. the following morning, over 20 hours without rest. When Chief Cobb finally ordered her to sleep, Dorothy collapsed on her bunk still wearing her blood-soaked uniform. She was asleep in seconds. She woke 3 hours later and immediately returned to duty. Over the following days and weeks, the full scope of what Dorothy Still had accomplished became clear. In the chaos of December 7, accurate record-keeping had been impossible. But as the Solace's medical staff reviewed their logs, a remarkable picture emerged. Dorothy Still had personally treated 103 wounded men during the Pearl Harbor attack and its immediate aftermath. Of those 103 men, 97 survived their initial wounds. In the hellish conditions of that day, with minimal supplies, no backup, and constant danger, a young nurse barely out of training had achieved a survival rate that seemed almost miraculous. But Dorothy would never talk about it. When reporters asked her about Pearl Harbor in the years after the war, she deflected. "I just did my job," she would say. Any nurse would have done the same. The military disagreed. Dorothy Still was awarded the Navy Cross, one of the highest military decorations. She was featured in recruitment posters. She became a symbol of American courage and resilience. Yet the military also tried to control her story. In the 1940s, the idea of women in combat roles was controversial. The Navy wanted to celebrate Dorothy's heroism, but not in a way that might suggest women could serve in frontline military positions. For decades, details of her actions at Pearl Harbor were classified or downplayed. It wasn't until the 1990s, when Dorothy was in her 70s, that the full story began to emerge. Military historians reviewing declassified documents discovered the extent of her contributions. Survivors of Pearl Harbor came forward with their own memories of the nurse who had saved their lives. One of them was Jimmy Larson, the 19-year-old sailor with catastrophic burns who had been Dorothy's first patient that terrible morning. He had survived, married, raised a family, and never forgotten the young nurse who had refused to let him die. In 1991, on the 50th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Jimmy traveled to Hawaii to attend a memorial ceremony. Dorothy was there too, elderly but still sharp, still humble about her role. Jimmy approached her, tears streaming down his face. "You told me I was going to survive," he said. "And I did. I've had 50 beautiful years because you saved my life that day." Dorothy hugged him, and for the first time in 5 decades, she allowed herself to cry about December 7, 1941. Dorothy Still passed away in 2003 at the age of 85. She spent her post-war life working as a nurse in civilian hospitals, never seeking recognition or fame. She married, raised 2 children, and lived a quiet life in suburban Pennsylvania. But her legacy lives on. The Navy's medical training now includes case studies based on her triage system at Pearl Harbor. The impromptu methods she developed for treating mass casualties under combat conditions are still taught to military medics today. Her story raises profound questions that resonate far beyond that terrible Sunday morning in Hawaii. What transforms an ordinary person into a hero? Is it training? Courage? Or simply being in the right place at the right moment with no choice but to act? Dorothy herself never claimed to be extraordinary. "I was terrified," she admitted in one of her rare interviews near the end of her life. "Every moment of that day, I was absolutely terrified. But the men needed help, and I was there. So I helped them. That's all." Perhaps that's the real lesson of Dorothy Still's story. Heroism isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite fear. It's the choice to run toward danger instead of away from it. It's the determination to do what needs to be done, even when every instinct screams to run. On December 7, 1941, a young nurse stood at a porthole and watched the world catch fire. She had 3 seconds to decide what kind of person she would be. She chose courage. And because of that choice, 97 men lived to see another day. The bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor changed the world. But they couldn't destroy the human spirit's capacity for compassion, sacrifice, and extraordinary courage. Dorothy Still proved that. One patient at a time. In memory of all the nurses, doctors, and medical personnel who served at Pearl Harbor and throughout World War II. Their courage saved thousands of lives and their dedication stands as a testament to the best of human nature in the darkest of times.